Paul Biya is 91, is the world's oldest leader and one of its longest-serving presidents, as he's held the post for 42 years. Now, he's still not formally declared his candidacy for October's polls, but some religious leaders have already spoken up, saying that an eighth term would be against the country's interests.
Paul Biya is under pressure, and he deserves it. In March 2024, two of Cameroon's largest opposition coalitions were suddenly outlawed. No trial, no warning, just gone. This isn't some rogue dictatorship collapsing overnight. This is Paul Biya, still firmly in power after 4 decades, scrambling to silence political threats before the 2025 elections. But why would a man who's ruled unchallenged for 40 years be so afraid now? Let's find out. Why do people want Paul Biya to leave? It started with his intense actions, those to stay in power and to remove any strong opposition. On an ordinary morning in March 2024, Cameroonians woke up to find that 2 of the country's largest opposition coalitions had simply been scrubbed from existence. No televised debate, no parliamentary vote, just a government announcement labeling them clandestine movements. A term vague enough to criminalize anything and specific enough to intimidate everyone. But this was no spontaneous move. It was a calculated maneuver, part of a strategy Biya has mastered over decades. Make politics impossible before it becomes dangerous. And in a year inching closer to the 2025 presidential election, this wasn't censorship. It was preemptive warfare. This wasn't about individual parties. It was about coalitions, alliances of parties, many once fragmented and ineffective on their own, finally beginning to unite around a shared cause, removing Biya. Their very collaboration posed a threat not because of the number of votes they controlled, but because of what they symbolized. A functioning opposition, a coordinated alternative, a new vocabulary, post-Biya. That symbolism was intolerable. By banning these coalitions, Biya didn't just dismantle their organizational infrastructure, he forced them back into political isolation. Without legal recognition, they can't hold public meetings, can't fundraise, can't campaign, and can't access the national media. In short, they've been turned invisible. But the move was more than just domestic manipulation. It was a signal to international observers. Don't bother waiting for fair elections. We've already decided the outcome. And the timing was not a coincidence. By March, opposition groups had already begun strategizing voter mobilization campaigns. Youth leaders were organizing registration drives. Some coalitions had even announced plans for a united presidential ticket. But all of that disappeared with one stroke of a pen. It was a reset, one designed not to return Cameroon to order, but to freeze it in fear. Still, if Biya thought that erasing opposition on paper would dissolve it on the ground, he underestimated one thing. Desperation has a way of reorganizing itself. And something unexpected started happening. The banned coalitions didn't collapse into silence. Instead, they scattered, regrouping in private homes, encrypted chats, and informal networks. They moved offline, underground. And ironically, the very ban that was meant to paralyze them gave them a new identity, the forbidden alternative. Among the younger population, that label carried weight. It turned bureaucratic injustice into a badge of authenticity. If the state had to ban it, maybe it was real. Maybe it was powerful. And this is where Biya's strategy starts to backfire. His control has always relied on a delicate illusion, that resistance is futile and alternatives are impossible. But when you ban something, you don't just remove it. You make people wonder what you're afraid of. And when fear changes sides, power begins to shift. Still, the political opposition isn't Biya's only problem. While banned coalitions regroup in the shadows, there's another, far more volatile force that cannot be managed with legal bans or press releases. A force with weapons, with anger, and with nothing left to lose. So if outlawed political coalitions were step 1 in Biya's suppression plan, what happens when the threat isn't politicians, but separatists with guns? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Once the regime dismantled the organizational frameworks of opposition coalitions, it didn't pause to celebrate. It pivoted immediately to what it saw as the next threat, the individuals who refused to vanish. After all, banning a party doesn't silence the people in it. So Paul Biya's strategy evolved. If the structure can't be destroyed publicly, then the faces of resistance must be discredited privately, punished institutionally, and isolated emotionally. And so, the spotlight shifted to Cameroon's most recognizable opposition figures, those who couldn't be erased from the public imagination as easily as a name in a registry. Among them stood Maurice Kamto, a constitutional lawyer and former minister turned political rebel, not a firebrand, not a militia leader. A man who wore suits, spoke calmly, and simply demanded that elections mean something. In most democracies, someone like Kamto would be an asset to the process. Under Biya, he became a threat that needed neutralizing. Kamto wasn't just detained, he was accused of rebellion, inciting insurrection, and threatening the stability of the nation. The charges were theatrical, designed less for a court and more for the nightly news cycle. His supporters, over 200 of them, were rounded up in waves, many while sleeping, some pulled from homes without warrants, others after peaceful marches. It wasn't just repression, it was a calculated attempt to traumatize a movement. But this tactic had an unintended effect. Instead of weakening opposition momentum, it created a psychological shift. In homes, in universities, in churches, a dangerous realization began to sink in. If peaceful criticism results in prison, then maybe silence isn't safety, it's surrender. People started whispering a phrase that had long been taboo in Biya's Cameroon. If Kamto can be arrested for a tweet, then no one is free. The act of detaining him became its act of resistance. Every visit to the prison, every donation to his legal fund, every social media post calling for his release became a form of digital civil disobedience. The regime knew this and responded with a tactic even more sinister than imprisonment: psychological invisibility. They didn't put Kamto on trial immediately. They kept him in pre-trial detention for weeks, then months. They didn't give daily updates. They kept the details murky. This tactic, often called soft erasure, is used by regimes that understand how to kill momentum not with violence, but with uncertainty. If you can't inspire fear through bloodshed, you inspire fatigue through silence. For Biya's inner circle, this strategy had precedent. Across Africa and beyond, authoritarian leaders have discovered the power of invisible incarceration. No pictures, no video, just rumors. Is he sick? Has he been tortured? Has he flipped? The uncertainty becomes more powerful than clarity. It fragments support, it breeds paranoia, and most importantly, it buys time. But time, in this case, didn't heal the regime's fear. It fed it. Because when Kamto was eventually released without a conviction, he walked out not as a defeated man, but as a symbol, a figure transformed. In the public eye, he had endured the worst the regime could throw at him and returned with clean hands and unshaken conviction. The cell became his pulpit. The charges became proof of the regime's desperation. And here lies the irony. In trying to erase his influence, Biya's regime turned him into a myth, and myths, unlike politicians, don't fade at the ballot box. But Kamto's story is just one among many. Less visible opposition figures, local activists, lawyers, student organizers, faced their versions of the same punishment. Travel bans, frozen accounts, mysterious disappearances, blackmail campaigns. The goal was never just punishment, it was total social isolation. Make resistance so costly, so lonely, so psychologically draining that even thinking critically becomes a personal risk. Yet every arrest added fuel to a quiet storm. Communities began organizing bail funds under the radar. Lawyers from the diaspora stepped in to defend political detainees. Underground news bulletins began circulating from city to city, exposing courtroom abuses and police misconduct. Each crackdown planted another seed of resistance, which brings us to the next chapter in this unraveling. Because while Biya fought to control political speech and jail its messengers, he forgot one thing: not all battles are fought in the capital. Far from Yaoundé, another fire was already burning. A fire in the Anglophone regions, one he could neither ban nor jail into silence. Here the people no longer asked for change, they demanded separation. This didn't happen overnight. It began with grievances, real, long-standing, and deeply personal. For decades, English-speaking Cameroonians had voiced frustrations about marginalization. They lived in a country with two official languages, but found their courts, schools, and government increasingly dominated by French. English-speaking teachers were reassigned by Francophone bureaucrats. Anglophone lawyers were forced to apply French civil codes. Court cases couldn't be properly defended. Schools couldn't be properly taught. When Anglophone teachers and lawyers peacefully protested these injustices in 2016, they didn't ask for secession. They asked for fairness. They carried signs, not guns. But what they got in return were tear gas, arrests, and a swift militarized response from Biya's regime. The message from Yaoundé was chilling. Equality was negotiable, but obedience was not. That response radicalized a generation. When peaceful avenues collapsed, anger calcified into resistance. What began as civil disobedience soon turned into armed insurgency. Young men disappeared into the bush and emerged as fighters under the banner of Ambazonia, a self-declared independent state for Anglophone Cameroon. They weren't operating from parliament. They were operating from mountain camps and forest outposts. Their fight wasn't about ballots anymore. It was about borders. Suddenly, Biya wasn't just facing activists. He was facing militias. And his response? Brutal and relentless. Military convoys were deployed to villages. Entire communities were accused of harboring separatists. Homes were razed. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Human rights groups documented the use of torture, extrajudicial killings, and even the burning of elderly citizens in their homes. What began as a language dispute had now become one of the most underreported humanitarian crises in the world. But this war had another battleground: the internet. In 2017, as the insurgency gained traction, the Biya regime took an unprecedented step. It shut down internet access across the Anglophone regions. For months, cities like Biya and Bamenda were digitally silenced. No emails, no social media, no news. It was an information blackout meant to crush momentum. But it also revealed something deeper: fear. The regime wasn't just afraid of guns, it was afraid of stories. Because the Anglophone struggle had begun to echo across borders. Activists in the diaspora, from Germany to the US, began documenting atrocities, raising funds, and pushing international organizations to intervene. The regime couldn't jail them all. It couldn't ban their websites. So it did the next best thing. It made sure the world never heard their voices from inside the country. But even silence couldn't stop the escalation. Separatist fighters started enforcing their governance. They imposed lockdowns. They banned government-run schools. They issued their ID cards. The state within a state was no longer theory. It was reality. The Biya government responded with more soldiers, more checkpoints, and more arrests. But the cycle had already locked in. Brutality bred rebellion, and rebellion justified more brutality. And here lies the contradiction at the core of Biya's rule. In the name of unity, he has fractured the country. In his refusal to acknowledge Anglophone grievances, he created the very rebellion he feared. What began as a demand for inclusion evolved into a battle for independence, and by the time the regime started talking about dialogue, it was too late. The dialogue had already been replaced with detonations. This war isn't confined to the battlefield. It casts a shadow over the very idea of democracy in Cameroon. How can national elections be considered legitimate when entire regions are locked in armed conflict? How do you campaign where candidates can't walk the streets? How do you vote when people don't even believe they belong to the country on the ballot? These questions are no longer theoretical, they're immediate. Because the 2025 elections are approaching, and the regime is pretending it can conduct a national vote while a civil war rages in its western provinces, but the cracks are widening. And now, Biya faces an even more dangerous threat, not from guns or protests, but from the calendar. Because if elections are the next flashpoint and trust is already gone, what happens when voting becomes just another illusion? Where most governments fear the ticking clock of elections, Biya has learned to hold time hostage. Parliamentary and municipal elections, postponed. Local councils, extended. Deadlines, rewritten. In Biya's version of democracy, the calendar is not a rule. It's a flexible suggestion. Since 2020, Biya's regime has found increasingly creative excuses to delay scheduled elections. The most popular? Financial constraints. It's a masterstroke of political irony. How does one of the world's longest-serving presidents in a resource-rich nation suddenly find itself unable to fund democracy? But the claim works because it's just vague enough to sound legitimate and just broad enough to avoid accountability. Yet the real strategy is far more calculated. Postponing elections in Cameroon isn't just about logistics, it's about control over political temperature. Each time tensions rise, elections are pushed back, giving the regime space to cool public outrage, arrest vocal opponents, reshuffle bureaucrats, or pass laws that tilt the next contest even further in their favor. It's not a delay, it's a recalibration. And this strategy works best when people are exhausted. When the opposition spends months preparing for a vote, investing in logistics, messaging, and coalition building, only to have the date moved at the last minute, it creates fatigue. Supporters lose momentum, funding dries up, volunteers burn out, and the public, already disillusioned, shrugs and walks away. The most dangerous outcome isn't rage, it's apathy, and that is exactly what Biya needs to survive. But the regime doesn't just manipulate timing, it manipulates meaning. By turning elections into hollow rituals, the government can claim legitimacy on paper without risking real contestation. The system is designed to function like a well-oiled theater. The stage is set, candidates appear, votes are counted, but the outcome was written long before the ballots arrived. This manipulation has bred a dangerous form of quiet rebellion among young Cameroonians. Instead of trusting the process, they're rebuilding their own. Civil society groups, student unions, and digital activists have shifted their attention from endorsing candidates to defending the vote itself, not promoting manifestos, but safeguarding mechanisms. Registration drives have become protest tools. Slogans have shifted from "vote for change" to "protect your future." The ballot, stripped of credibility by the regime, is being reimagined by the people as a statement of defiance, a way to say we're still here in a system designed to erase them. This push for registration is not without risk. In some areas, especially those with strong opposition leanings, registration offices experience technical issues suspiciously close to deadlines. IDs go missing. Biometric machines break down. New voters find their names absent from the official rolls. It's not voter suppression with guns, it's voter suppression with glitches. Yet the people continue, because even the illusion of participation is better than surrender, and that resilience has pushed the regime into a corner. If voter registration surges and opposition candidates somehow regain momentum despite bans and arrests, what will Biya do next? That question haunts the 2025 horizon, because at this point, canceling or rigging the presidential election is not a hypothetical, it's expected. The only uncertainty is the method. Will it be postponed again under the guise of national security? Will courts suddenly disqualify key opposition figures? Will newly drawn electoral boundaries conveniently dilute urban resistance? Or will the regime simply declare itself the winner through tightly controlled media narratives and a predictable constitutional court ruling? Biya's inner circle understands one thing clearly. The country may not explode when you rig elections, but it fractures, quietly, permanently. The youth lose faith in the system. The diaspora tightens its support for exile opposition groups. Separatist movements gain recruits. And most dangerously, every day, Cameroonians learn to decouple voting from meaning. That's not just a political risk, it's an existential one. Because once people stop believing elections matter, what alternatives are left? Which brings us to the final thread: international scrutiny. Because while Biya may control the borders of his regime, he can't control the stories spilling beyond them. And as 2025 looms, eyes around the world are starting to notice that Cameroon isn't preparing for an election, it's bracing for a reckoning. As the 2025 elections approach under a storm cloud of delays, arrests, and armed conflict, foreign governments and international institutions remain largely polite, distant, and diplomatically vague. The African Union, the European Union, and even the United Nations issue statements about concern, dialogue, and regional stability. But the truth is more damning. They're all waiting to see how much Biya gets away with before deciding if they care. Why? Because Cameroon is not convenient. It's not a regional economic powerhouse. It's not strategically pivotal like Nigeria. It's not flush with oil reserves like Angola. It isn't a media darling like South Africa. Instead, it sits awkwardly between crises, exporting silence more than headlines. To most Western capitals, it's a foreign policy side note, a place to monitor, not confront. But willful ignorance is not neutrality. It's a complicity in slow-motion collapse. Human rights organizations know this. Reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others have documented everything. Torture in the Anglophone regions, mass arrests of peaceful protesters, bans on civil organizations, and state interference in electoral processes. These aren't rumors, they're case files. But no sanctions have followed, no diplomatic penalties, no real consequences. Because Paul Biya has learned how to play the game. He provides just enough plausible deniability, just enough performance of democracy, just enough counterinsurgency cooperation to keep international pressure at bay. He attends summits. He talks about reform. He maintains a facade of legitimacy. And in return, the world pretends he's not running a one-man state with a shrinking circle of enforcers. The consequences of this external silence are deeply internal. In the absence of international outrage, Cameroonian civil society is forced to carry the weight of resistance alone. From underground media outlets reporting abuses at great personal risk to human rights lawyers facing surveillance and threats, these are the people holding the line while the global community looks away. Diaspora groups are also rising in response. Across France, Belgium, Canada, and the United States, Cameroonian exiles are forming political fronts, funding voter registration campaigns, amplifying censored news, and pressuring foreign governments to stop treating Biya like a reliable partner. But it's an uphill battle. Lobbying isn't cheap, and exile doesn't come with a microphone. Meanwhile, the international press, so quick to dissect turmoil in other parts of Africa, remains curiously restrained on Cameroon. Reports are occasional, often shallow, and rarely investigated. The world knows more about the opposition movements in Iran and Venezuela than it does about a country where peaceful protest can earn you years in prison and elections can be rescheduled like dentist appointments. This selective visibility is no accident. Cameroon's crisis lacks the spectacular visuals that usually spark Western outrage. There's no iconic image like a toppled statue or a burning embassy. The repression here is quiet, polished with legalism, buried in bureaucracy, and masked with public diplomacy. It's not cinematic, it's administrative. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because it gives the illusion that everything is under control, until it's not. But cracks are forming. In recent months, murmurs within regional blocs like ECOWAS and the African Union suggest a growing discomfort with Biya's endless rule. Not necessarily because of principle, but because instability is contagious. A fraudulent election in Cameroon could ripple through West and Central Africa, emboldening other authoritarian regimes, undermining reformers, and shaking already fragile coalitions. The question is whether these institutions are willing to risk their reputations to draw a line, or whether they'll once again default to statements about dialogue. Cameroonians are not waiting. From the cities to the bush, in prisons and on phones, they are pushing forward, registering, organizing, documenting, voting, not because they believe the process is fair, but because they refuse to be erased. Even in the absence of global solidarity, their resistance persists. But make no mistake, international silence is a form of strategy. And every day that passes without pressure gives the regime room to recalibrate its control. So, will the world act before the election becomes another autocratic charade? Let us know in the comment section. Or will we once again learn, too late, that ignoring the signs of collapse is the most dangerous policy of all? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.